Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 74, where I take you behind the scenes of some of your new and previous favorite podcasts. And I'm going to blow up your subscription list again today, guys, because if this one isn't already on it, I want to make sure that you add it, because it has quickly become one of my favorite shows over the past 2 months or so. I guess I found it a couple of months ago. The show is called Where There's Smoke, and the hosts are Brett Gajda and Nick Jaworski. And Brett and Nick, both of them, have been kind enough to join me here today for episode 74. So Brett and Nick, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here, man.
Thanks. I was waiting for Brett.
I know. I figured that. I felt that. I thought I better say something.
We said Brett and Nick in that order. So
that's true. True story.
Actually, I was pulling that off of the listing in Pocket Cast. That's how you guys are listed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I was contractually. I got that in the deal.
to have the top billing?
Yeah.
What do they call the top line? Is that what they call it in movies?
Yeah.
Or
he's got the the 48 font, and you've got the 12 font, Nick.
Yeah, I'm the with.
There you go.
With Nick Jaworski.
Well, Brett, Nick, either one of you who want to tackle this one, for anybody who hasn't heard of the show, can you give them just a quick rundown of what the show is, and then I want to kind of dive into some history.
Yeah, sure. So Where There's Smoke, our byline is self-development through the lens of current events, pop culture, and experience. But really, we'll get into the history, I guess. But the show was kind of created as this idea of, what if The Daily Show was about, self-development or being a better human being? And it's very much a show where we kind of filter what's going on in the world or pop culture, and we talk about what's happening, but there's always a theme. We're always talking about, some sort of concept, whether it be willpower or quality or procrastination or whatever it might be. But it's a very dynamic show, very crafted. Some people call it NPR-ish or public radio-ish in the fact that, high production value. We're bringing in audio clips, movie clips, music, all kinds of stuff. So I don't know. I guess that's maybe an accurate description of it. It's a journey through ideas and sound, and our goal is to entertain and educate at the same time.
Yeah, and it's definitely highly produced, and I definitely want to talk a little bit about those clips, because it is probably one of the characteristics among several that set when Where There's Smoke aside from other shows in your category, if you will, especially if you want to call it a self-help category. I don't know. What do you guys think? Before we get into the personal backgrounds here, I'm sort of reluctant to call it a self-help podcast. I mean, I guess that's sort of like we were talking about, sort of the top line of it, but there's so much more descriptive-wise than that. Would you agree?
I would say that the show has changed too a little bit, right, Brett?
Yeah, I would say the show has changed a bit too. My background is I've been working in kind of self-development, professional development for the last 10 plus years, and so when I created the show, it was very much created with this idea of how do I do what people are doing in self-development and, professional development, but in a way more fun way. So kind of, blend a business training with the Tonight Show, and let's have some fun. I think the show's evolved, and a lot of that has to do with Nick's involvement as we've become, more of a partnership. And now it's, it takes on a lot of different feels, but at its core, Nick and I are still very interested in this idea of people taking away something from every episode that they can apply to, whether it's to, you want to say, to be a better human being or make life easier or to to make some sort of change in your life or whatever it might be. So to be honest, we've had conversations recently about that term because I think a lot of people have a stigma. And we've literally had listeners say to us, I wasn't going to listen to the show because I saw the term self-development, but then I did, and I'm glad I did. So I think we set ourselves aside from shows that people would think of in that realm, but we both like the idea of having a show that actually is doing something positive like that in the world. Is that fair, Nick?
Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I think the show has just changed so much, and I think that I think that one of the defining characteristics of the show now is a real honesty in this idea that we don't always know. Like, I think that's a big part. And I think that our audience, the more that I talk to them, I think that they really appreciate an element of, we might talk about, like tomorrow's episode is willpower. And in the end, like, there's some very tangible ideas to take away. But the idea is that through all of these ideas and clips, and we try to keep the pace very, 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 very fast, that there's going to be things that really you grab onto from that 30 minutes that resonate with where you are. And because of our pacing and because of our scripting and stuff, I think that it really is allowed to, hit home for some people.
And gentlemen, a quick apology. I usually advise folks of timing. That episode that Nick was describing on Willpower is the current week's episode, because we're about 5 or 6 days in advance of release of this episode.
Yeah,
so that one should be in your feed right now, folks. So
you're well ahead of us.
I should have told you guys that in advance. Hey, we're all trying to improve, right? So before I get into more about the show, and I want to come back to something you said a minute ago, Brett, here in just a minute, but I want folks to get a little bit more knowledgeable about you guys as sort of people and your background before the show began. So who wants to go first on kind of the bio, the origin story of yourselves, if you will, your prior experience?
Well, I'll let my elder go first.
Wow, with the age thing.
Well, since I've been around a couple of days longer than Nick, I'll take that. So I guess, the short version, I'm born and raised in Toronto, Canada. I lived in San Francisco for 19 years, and we started the show while I was in San Francisco, but I recently moved back to Toronto. My professional background, I was in high school and in college, I was a theater major and a music minor. I was in band, so that plays into what I do a lot. I joke with people, it's true, but that in high school I was voted most likely to replace Johnny Carson, which ages me. I'd rather replace Jimmy Fallon these days. But I've always been into kind of entertainment and music and pop culture. But then as I got into my 30s, I got involved in professional and self-development. I started working with companies and just training people on mindset and motivation, all kinds of different areas. Now I work with Fortune 1000 companies. I work with executive teams, helping organizations to build cultures, helping teams to communicate better, helping teams to create environments where people actually produce at higher levels, where people are happy, where people actually like what they're doing. So I've been doing that for the last 6-7 years. And so when we kind of created the show, that really was me saying, okay, so I have all this experience in, self-development and working with big organizations and working with individuals and entrepreneurs and helping them be better. But I also really like the idea of entertaining people and having learning be fun. And so I think my entire history is one of the things I really love about this show. I feel like going all the way back to, being a drama geek in high school, through university, through my career, Where There's Smoke is a place where it's my full expression. It's kind of all those elements of me coming together in one thing.
And Nick?
Wow, that was so succinct there at the end. I come from St. Louis, and we can talk about sort of the very strange circumstances in which Brett and I found ourselves living in the same apartment for 3 months.
I was going to bring that up, actually. The whole I moved out and crashed on his couch for a year thing. I did want to bring that up.
So I guess we can talk about that in a second. But, my background is in music, and starting with the love of audio production, listening to the Beatles and that kind of stuff. And then growing up, and I say this a lot, but my hipster cred is I used to listen to This American Life back before it was a podcast. Sit down Sunday nights and listen to This American Life. And so when I was in high school and went to college and, just was a music teacher, have a master's in music ed, and found myself sort of profoundly unhappy doing that in Chicago, moved back to St. Louis, and without a plan, just started editing a podcast. I still can't believe this is what I do for a living. And then out of sort of a series of events, Where There's Smoke comes around as really, as much as anything, like a lens through which to just play. Like I really think that the show, I hope it does, really sort of rings with like real sense of like joy in its production, as much as it can be work, but that, from show concepts to execution, that there's a polish and also just a sense of these guys are having fun and doing clever things and doing. So I don't know. I don't have a succinct button to the end of the story, but that's the shortened version of like how I got there and what I hope we're doing.
Well, it's clear that comes from age, Nick.
Well, yeah, I haven't gotten there yet. I'm still in my mid-early 30s.
I think the interesting thing, Dan and Nick, is that there is a similarity where I really think that this show for Nick and I is a culmination of kind of everything we've done, right? Like Nick's history in music and production, listening to This American Life in high school, being a teacher, and how much that comes into when he's helping me craft scripts. So I think for both of us, it is kind of the culmination of a lot of things we've done. And as Nick said, we kind of have this playground now where we get to bring it all to the table.
Yeah, I don't think there's been an episode concept that one of us has pitched that we haven't been like, all right, let's think about it, which is fun.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Brett, because I was, I like most people during an interview, I'm taking notes as we go, and I just wrote on my iPad, I wrote tying entertainment to education. That's the note I just wrote that I was going to bring up and discuss, and you just said it succinctly. I think that's exactly what you guys have done with Where There's Smoke, is that it is almost this concept of the entertainment being some of the clips from movies and sound and music, yet with that sort of self-help umbrella or educational or self-improvement concept coming through, and that's what I think makes your show stand out head and shoulders above anything in either category because of its uniqueness. Is there a disagreement with that summary, or would you say that hit the nail on the head? What do you think, Brett? Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I mean, years ago, I don't remember who said this to me, but someone said to me in my speaking life as a speaker, they told me that I was an edutainer. They said, I really like about you is you educate, but you entertain at the same time. And I always liked that. And I always thought that's what I want to do, because I'm not interested in just making people laugh and entertaining people. I kind of like, stirring the pot, having people think about stuff. And I'm also not really interested in, being whoever you want to say, Oprah or Tony Robbins or whatever, and just being out there talking about spirituality or being better or business. That's not enough for me either. It's both. And so, yeah, I think that's very, I appreciate the comment. And I also like that how you experience the show is, I think, what I'm personally and what we're collectively trying to create.
And Nick, would you say that is something that in the production process has always become sort of a top shelf concern, is maintaining that sort of, you mentioned earlier, it's rapid pace and it's sort of edited that way, and it's put together so that there's very few lulls, there's very few downtime, and that it is kind of maintaining this entertaining thing while you are also absorbing something that could be of value to you personally.
Yeah, I remember very, very early on, I remember exactly where I was standing when Brett and I were talking on the phone for the first time. And he was describing sort of his concept of the show, blah, blah, blah. And then to me, the pacing of the show, as much as it is inspired by other things, Daily Show is a very good reference point. The show has a pacing of a YouTube video to me. And in YouTube, you're allowed to make really jarring edits for some reason. Like that's a thing you can do on YouTube. And so we don't do that, but we really try to keep things chopped up. And then the clips become this really like a shorthand to sort of like burrow an idea within you, right? Like, oh, I know that's from, Anchorman. So like it's a way to be like, oh, this concept may apply to me. As much as it is a clip is a good way to just transition from one idea to the next. But we do spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, well, here's this pacing, and we can use that. We can speed things up and slow things down for impact. And but we also can use that pacing and thinking about, like, well, how can we split up this show in a way that all these ideas have a larger meaning? And that's something that we deal with. Brett will tell you, scripts are always longer than they end up on the show. And then what gets cut out is a lot of the extra stuff that just confuses the points you want to make. So we're always focusing on how can this be clear so that our audience can actually take something away from it.
And I think that comes through in the end product for sure. I mean, that's something that it's paying off as far as I'm concerned, because I think that's nuance and care in detail that I don't put in my own show, that I think a lot of people don't. And I think that's, again, something that sets you guys apart. But, Nick, I wanted to go back because before we get too far into the details with the show production and the process and topics and these other things I want to talk to you about, I do want you to recant, if you would, sort of how this whole idea became launched and how you ended up moving and so on and so forth. Let's hear that story.
Well, how about this? How about Brett starts with where the idea came from?
There we go.
And then we can come to me where I come into the story.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. So, so I guess the gist of it is, this really started for me 2012, I think, initially. So as I said, in my career, I've been professional speaker working in personal professional development. And I always knew that eventually I wanted to break out and do my own thing. Everything I was doing previously was under other people's umbrellas, working for other companies, kind of delivering other people's materials, getting to bring myself to it a little bit, but not my companies, not my brand. And in 2012 is when I first really seriously started thinking about, okay, what is it? Like, how am I going to do this? I started making some videos and putting stuff online. Didn't really feel right. But around that time, I had this idea. I feel like I always remember it came from watching The Daily Show and thinking, I'd love to make a show like that, where we're having fun, we're bringing in clips, but we're like, there's a lesson or we're teaching something. And somewhere along the line, I came up with this idea. I had the name and the tagline. And so I would go to events and people would ask me what I was doing. And I'd say, well, I'm playing with different ideas. And every so often I would go, well, I have this idea for a show called Where There's Smoke. And it's self-development through the lens of current events, sports, and pop culture. And I basically look at the world and filter the world and teach life lessons. And I thought it was going to be a video show. And what would happen is 6 months later, 8 months later, a year later, I'd bump into people from an event I was at or I met. And they'd go, oh, you're the Where There's Smoke guy. And I didn't even have a show. I just had a tagline. So that was when I started to realize that was a really good idea. But again, thinking it was a video show, I was like, how am I going to do this? I don't have the money. I don't have the production, blah. So I sat on it for a couple of years. And then in 2014 in the summer, it kind of hit me like a brick wall. I was like, why wouldn't I make a podcast? Because I don't even watch videos online, but I listen to podcasts. Why wouldn't this be a podcast? So then I had the idea that it would be a podcast, but I was in the same predicament, which was that I have no technical skills. And I was thinking to myself that if I found somebody who was able to do this, it would probably cost me $500 an episode to get it made. And I just didn't have that. So again, I sat on it for probably a month. And then I just decided, okay, let me just see if this person, I don't even know who they are, if they exist. So I basically wrote a very, very specific Elance ad. For those people who don't know Elance, it's like a marketplace for contractors, people who do all kinds of stuff from graphic design through to audio work. So I wrote this very specific ad. And I said, you must like This American Life, The Daily Show, Radio Lab. You must know about pop culture. You must have these audio skills. My goal was that I only wanted to attract someone who actually was this person. I still got like probably 30 responses, of which
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But I never looked at them really, Nick, right? Because we ended up connecting like literally within 24 hours, right?
Right.
But I got all these responses. Most of them were BS. Like people, oh, yeah, writing me from Romania. Like, yeah, I'm a big fan of pop culture. I'm like, no, you're not really. So anyways, what happened was within 24 hours of me placing this ad on Elance, I heard another podcast, right? As you mentioned, Nick has his own company called Podcast Monster. I heard another podcast where a podcaster had decided to do something kind of creative and different than they normally do. Their show's normally just I'm talking into a mic. They did this NPR production, and I was listening to this thing going, this is kind of what I want to do. And at the end of it, the woman said, I produced this in association with Nick Jaworski at Podcast Monster. And I said, oh my God, I got to call this guy. So I shot Nick an email. I still have the original response he gave me. It was like, the date's like November 18th or something, 2014.
November 6th, 15th. I think it might be my birthday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it was your birthday. You wrote me back and you said, I'm interested, but it's my birthday tonight and I'm going out. So let's talk tomorrow.
That's not true. I didn't go out.
Or whatever. But the next day we spoke on the phone and he's like, well, what's this about? And I start explaining to him, my idea, right? Where there's smoke. And he goes, oh, I think I just responded to your Elance ad.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we found ourselves out in the digital ether. We ran across each other twice, which is,
Both of you reached out at almost the same time.
Yeah.
I
don't know. Do you want to pick up the story, Nick?
Well, yeah. And then it sort of became this song and dance about, which is understandable. Like Brett obviously really wanted to make this show and I really wanted to make this show, but I had accepted an internship with George Lucas's nonprofit in San Francisco to do some social media stuff. And so just because I needed to shake things up in my life. And here's a guy from San Francisco who wants to make a show. And, he's right. The cost of the show would be prohibitive to most people to make. So, and I was like, hey, if you can find somebody or if you can put me up, I will edit this show for free. And so then he's like, cool. I mean, he talked to his wife. She apparently was cool with it, which is crazy and awesome. And then I took a road trip out with some dinosaurs to San Francisco. And I showed up on a Friday night, and Brett was out of the country. And it was just me and the rest of his family for a few days. And then we got to work. I mean, it was really like it's a very surreal experience. And like looking back on it, it really is kind of a great origin story.
Yeah. So one of my favorite parts of the story, I don't know if you've ever heard me say this, Nick, I tell it all the time, but what we actually did in like November was we agreed to make a pilot episode just to see how we'd work together, which ended up being our second episode, or it's our third episode actually, which is called On Time Is Late. So we did this pilot episode, and the agreement was that Nick would do it for $150. So it was kind of like, all right, let's just do this pilot episode. So we did the pilot episode. It worked great. We decided we wanted to work together. Then I said, well, hey, just come live with me. But I've still to this day never paid him though.
I had forgotten about that. But you know what? Brett? I think we're good.
Oh, dude, you're the best, man. Sweet.
I'm glad we were able to reconcile this debt here on the Podcast Digest.
Better now.
That is a crazy story. You know what's funny is I've only conducted one in-person interview so far on this podcast. Everything else has been via Skype. One time, and it was this guy on this tech podcast, Taylor Martin. He has a show called Untethered back in my previous episodes, folks, if you want to go back and hear this. And I reached out to him. He had never heard from me. Him and I had no communication. And the only reason I really reached out to him was I'd heard he relocated up to Pennsylvania, where I am. I'm about 45 minutes outside of Philadelphia. And I reached out to him and said, hey, since you're local, maybe we could do it in person. And he was like, sure, what's your address? Guy came to my house, never having met me, in the internet world where people are connecting, to meet in person, especially at one's home, tends to be one of those kind of risky ventures. And everything went great. But to hear, Nick, that you arrived at Brett's house with him not there, you've got his whole family there, and you stayed the weekend is
I stayed, amazing. He didn't show up for a few days, and it's funny. I remember saying to Brett on the phone, like, I'm not a murderer. Like, I remember saying something along the lines of, like, I'm a teacher, like, I'm good with kids. Like, I remember all of these things, just because I was, it's kind of a fraught situation. But I think
the kids with their homework.
Right, well, I think in the end, right, that there's this idea, and like in your situation where, once someone's put their name out there as being in a space, like, they may be weird and it may be awkward, but they're not going to like murder you. Like that would be, everybody would know where they were. That's a problem.
Right. Brett, how'd you feel about that whole situation? You were taking a risk, obviously, right?
I guess I was honestly, so my entire focus was how to solve the problem. So my problem, I had two problems. Problem number one was I didn't know if this person existed, the person I would work with on the show. And problem number two is if they did, I couldn't pay them. Right. I mean, so once I solved problem number one, I was just so focused on solving problem number two. I probably would have told Nick I'd wash his dishes. I was just like, hey, man, I just got to figure out a way to make this show, So, it's funny because in retrospect, and Nick and I have talked about this, it's like I don't even remember the conversation I had with my wife. But just, for everyone out there, I have a 4-year-old who at the time was a 3-year-old. So like imagine those of you who are married, you tell your wife that you're going to move some stranger in you're going to turn your home office into a bedroom and move some stranger in along with your 3-year-old, right? And I don't remember her having any pushback. My wife is like
super cool.
She's
super cool.
She's just an incredibly nice human being. And then like Nick said, then when he shows up, I'm in Europe on business and, she greets him and like, oh, okay, fine, right? So yeah, but for me, honestly, it was just like I was trying to figure out any way to do it. And when I thought, hey, man, move in here for a month, and, because initially it was like he was going to move in and then maybe try to find a place. And then it was like, well, why would you go anywhere? Right. So we lived together for 3 months. And the show, we often say this, and this is true, that the show would not be what the show is. We would not have the relationship we have if we didn't live together for those 3 months. Like those 3 months were so critical to be able to really mold the beginning of this show in person, to be able to create a relationship. And now, even though we don't see each other that much, I live in Toronto, Nick lives in St. Louis, we have a relationship based on those initial 3 months.
That show is that the show, the amount of back and forth that the show requires, like a purely digital relationship, I don't think it could sustain it. Like we're back and forth all week until the show is done. And so to have that personal connection is the only way that it works.
I'll tell you, it is a killer origin story. And what I was thinking as you guys were kind of retelling this is that old expression people say all the time, that with great risk comes great reward. And that's almost sort of what you guys did. You both took a huge chance on this potentially blowing up in your faces in any thousand number of ways. Didn't happen. It went right. And now look where you guys are. I mean, it's an awesome story. And, no matter what the future is for Where There's Smoke, it's always going to be awesome to look back on how this began, because I don't know that many other podcasts in the iTunes directory right now has a story even remotely similar, which is fitting for your show as far as I'm concerned. But Brett, before we get back into current day stuff, I wanted to touch on one thing you mentioned, and you just mentioned it in real brief, but I want to know about sort of where this title came from, right? It's one half of an expression that everybody knows, but it's just the first half. Sort of like, what's sort of the thought process behind the show title?
So the thought process is, again, as someone who I'm very interested in human psychology, how we operate, why we do the things we do. So I tend to watch things and filter things through that. So I'll be watching TV and, like even these days, not to get like, I watch Donald Trump and people will talk about one thing about him and I'm like underneath like saying, oh, well, he's doing that because of this psychological reason. He actually has this belief and this, like, I'm always kind of looking at not what people are obviously talking about, but what I think is underneath. Even I'm a big sports fan and I often, talk about kind of the mindset of sports and things happen. And so I've always done that. And so that when I created the show in my mind, the idea was, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? That's the saying. And the way that it made sense in my brain was that, everybody else is talking about the smoke. They're talking about what everybody sees. And what we're going to do is we're going to clear the smoke out and we're going to actually like expose the fire and talk about what might really be going on underneath or something going on underneath that no one else is talking about. And so that was really where it came from. And it just, for me, it was, you don't need to say the whole idiom. So yeah, that's where the smoke came from. And that's, I think that's still true for the show. That's what we try to do with the show is we try to look at things in an unobvious way we start in one place and we end in another place.
Well, what's great about that show title, too, is that you guys had alluded to, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about here in just a moment, about sort of the show's evolution and sort of changes it's undergone over time. But that's the great thing about that title, right? It can sort of be interpreted in so many different ways, and listeners can almost sort of apply their own definition to it, and it's very flexible in that way. I've thought about that many times because my show here, the Podcast Digest, I'm kind of tied in. I've actually reached out to a few YouTube personalities and things, and I'm thinking to myself, well, if I did get a conversation with one of them, how would that sort of fit? And I feel kind of a little cramped by it. But with you guys, as your show continues to evolve and grow, you've got a wonderfully intriguing title that can sort of fit a listener's definition in any way. So I think that's an awesome title.
Yeah, and very early on, kind of a funny story, we got an email from a vaping company who wanted to know if they could sponsor our show. Clearly, they never listened to the show, but they saw the title and thought we were a show about smoking. So, we can go in any direction. We've got a lot of places to go.
Barbecue sauce?
Barbecue sauce, another option.
Yes, and barbecuing. In general, Weber, maybe, right?
Yeah, that's our fallback move.
Yeah,
the show about smoking meat.
Yes.
Oh my God, Brett, we should do that for April 1st.
An episode on barbecuing.
I am not kidding. Brett, let's talk about this later.
The idea's been born. And I want to go back to one other thing that was kind of came out in that conversation. Brett mentioned it real quickly, but Nick, I really want you to expand. We talked a little bit before that a lot of people listening to this episode right now are other podcasters, and Podcast Monster is a audio production company that you run. And I would like folks to know a little bit more about what else you do beyond Where There's Smoke and specifically more about this company.
Well, yeah. So in short, what I do, right, is podcasting has really sort of seen the resurgence. We all know that. I mean, you're here, we're all here. And because I say resurgence because there was a wave initially, 8-9 years ago. And what I do is I work with small business owners and some publications to figure out, I do consultation on, why a podcast and how I might do this podcast and what's the layout of this podcast and, all these. So I do those steps. And then, for 50-60% of those, then I work on production end with that. So either editing and assembly and publication and show notes. And, sometimes I do a little bit of guest booking and brainstorming show ideas. And so I'm working sort of constantly with content creators to help sort of keep the show moving along. And so, if even a year ago I was in San Francisco, even a year ago, if you'd said like, hey, Nick, this is what you do, and this is, it would have seemed insane. I mean, I think that where there's smoke for both Brett and I sort of serves as a business card as much as anything else, right? Which is why it's so important for us as, to be able to put as much time in as we do, to sort of say like, here's us at our best. So here's what we're capable of. And that's what we do at Podcast Monster. We do our best. Our tagline is, it's like, we make your podcast sound awesome is the sort of informal tagline.
I tell you, I wish I would have met either one of you before I ever launched this show, because you got Where There's Smoke, which we just finished talking about as a great title, and then Podcast Monster, which is another great name for a company. I'm just thinking to myself, you guys have the naming conventions down, which was actually a perfect segue, how professional, to the next thing I wanted to talk to you guys about, which is sort of the episode and topic selection. It's really cool, folks, as you subscribe to the show, link in the show notes, as always, you guys will go through their back catalog as I'm scrolling through on my phone right now, and you'll see in parentheses sort of the topic that both Brett and Nick were talking about. Sort of each show has a topic and a focus. How do you guys sort of come up with these topics? Do you guys just have like a big hat with all these topics in it, or sort of what's this process like? Who wants to take this one?
Well, I'll start.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I think it's a few different ways. Certainly when we started, there was a handful of topics, because I've been doing this for years, that I was like, oh, we're going to talk about this and this and this. But also the idea, if you go back to the idea of the show was that, or is that, we're also going to play off of what's happening in the world, right? So we have done episodes where it was just like, oh, I want to talk about this. But even if we want to talk about something, like even if we say, okay, so we did an episode on stillness, which was kind of a take on how people talk about hustle, and yet at the same time, that episode lined up with the week that the hustle was on the charts, right? Or Do the Hustle was on the charts. So we'll always, or if we decide, like we just did an episode on willpower, and I'd kind of wanted to do this episode for a while, but we decided to do it now because we linked it into New Year's resolutions, right? So we'll always usually link into whatever's going on in the world, or we will react from the world. So we did a Back to the Future Day episode, which is one of my favorites, and that was something I knew we wanted to do from day one. We did a Father's Day episode. We just made, this is kind of a little inside info, we literally just decided to kind of do a switch and see if we can figure out how to change next week's episode and do something that's going to in some way pay homage to David Bowie, who just passed away yesterday as we're recording this. So it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of, oh, we want to do this topic, or it's something happens in the world that makes us think about something and we want to play off of it. I don't know. Is there anything I missed, Nick?
No, I think that there's a lot of there's been very few times in which a show concept has come directly from me, just whole cloth. I mean, Brett usually comes up with, here's some thoughts I have, or I will throw here's a thing I thought was interesting generically. What do we think about this event or this topic? And then more often than not, we just sort of try to see like, well, how many connections can we make that with current events right now to make it relevant? But then the one thing I guess maybe we didn't talk about is there is this hesitance, I think, on both of our parts to make things too overly tied to an event. We want to make sure that the content is evergreen as much as we want to make it relevant now. And that's a tricky balance, So things like, the Tom Brady episode from our first three, right? That's a tricky one. It was directly related to the Super Bowl, all that stuff. But again, in 2 years from now, people are going to go like, oh, it just feels old, right? Because it's like, oh, that's a clip from so long ago. So it's a tricky walk.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up the evergreen concept, and that was sort of the parenthetical labels on the episode titles sort of will guide people to something maybe they're more interested in versus another, which, I love how you guys do that, because when it pops into my queue, I can clearly see, oh, I'm jumping on this one or what have you. And I think folks will really find that a benefit to especially those folks who have a ton of subscriptions like me. I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of the episodes, and I'm not going to go too far deep into the weeds because you guys just republished a previous episode back on January 5th, the How to Create (parentheses) Process episode, which I think is phenomenal. Listen, one of the few times you guys have had to use the edit or the beeping button.
That show is so weird though, because for the listeners, so we did an episode called Process, which the week before we decided we would do while we were making that, like we decided we were going to make an episode about making another episode, which is a very meta Where There's Smoke take on something. But strangely, that episode, I still think to this day, the one that we were talking about, which is on what? Values. Yeah. Was actually probably the most heated Brett and I have had, like, exchanges we've had in making a show. Most of the shows are not like that.
Well, and the fact that it was captured, and I'll tell you the reason why I think I love it so much is that, and you guys do a good job about this throughout the episode catalog, but that one in particular, I think, amped it up to another level. I've always said this about podcasts, that one of the reasons people subscribe is not just the content, but it's a lot about the hosts, right? People have to like you. People want to keep coming back to hear your voices, your experience, your stories, your take on things. And I think you get to go behind the curtain of Where There's Smoke and hear a lot more from Nick and Brett than you typically would do, right? A lot of that content is probably more unscripted than previous, right? It kind of just sort of happened, and
that's all unscripted.
It's all unscripted.
That's real deal. The only agreement we made that week was that, as opposed to, calling each other or leaving voicemails or whatever, that every conversation we'd have through Skype, so it was recorded, and we would shoot Voxers back and forth, so they were all recorded. So it was the same communication we'd have any week, but like Nick said, that was a really hard week, and so I had someone come write to me, or I think actually they posted this, I think, online. They said, coming out of that episode, I learned a few things. One is how hard you guys really work on this show, and two is that Brett loves F-bombs.
That's right. I forgot about that. Yeah, that week, and of course, so we did that episode on values. And then right away, and we've been recording that entire week, and then right away we took all of the audio that we had, which was hours of audio, and then dumped it off on a transcriber, who then turned it around to us, and then we read through all of it. And then this process, and that show is tricky, right? Because we wanted to make it documentary, but we also wanted to make sure we talked about how to go through a process too. So it was a tricky balance.
Well, it was one of my favorites, and I've got several favorites, but that one really stood out. And I think the reason it did is because it really humanizes the both of you. And I think, as you guys come back with the next episode and the next episode, I think it creates a lens now that people start to see through. Like you said, somebody who came back and said, wow, I had no idea what all went into that. And that was sort of, growing up, I'm a big movie fan, right? And I was one of those ones that would buy the DVDs, and I was always watching the director commentaries because I love to hear kind of like the story that went behind what happened here and there. And even now, when I watch some of my favorite movies with my wife, and she hasn't seen the director's commentary, I'll say, hey, that scene, this is what happened, this is how that got made, and so on and so forth. And that's obviously one of the tenets of me in this show, was to bring people kind of behind the scenes. And I think you guys did a great job with that episode. But there's another episode that I wanted to talk about, and I know you guys had mentioned on one of them that you'd gotten wonderful reception to, and it was a little bit of a departure for the two of you on Where There's Smoke, and this was the Christmas episode that I thoroughly enjoyed, and I alluded to earlier. Who wants to kind of tell us how this idea got started?
Well, it starts with us both loving Christmas and both loving Charlie Brown, and I honestly do not know who said it, but like somebody said, we got to do a Christmas special. And then it was just like happening.
Well, I think also, right, that one of the things that's happened through the show is, and this is definitely, even though we align in this way, this is more Nick's influence. Nick is a big television fan in the standpoint of like liking specific shows and how they do things and showrunners. So he's a big Community fan, Dan Harmon, for example. And so a lot of in the show, we're constantly working with story structure and arcs and all this stuff. But in essence, Nick has kind of become the showrunner of Where There's Smoke. And there is this television-esque production that happens. You know, we've even in the process episode, I think we compared it to the South Park, what they do in 6 days, right? So, you know, there was this kind of feeling of like, well, you can't have a TV show and not do a Christmas special, right? So I think it was our love of Christmas, and then we just got, you know, for lack of a better word, I did anyways, a little giddy about the idea that we got to do a Christmas special. And so it was inevitable that we were going to do it.
I got to write a new theme for it. Brett got to look up old 80s references about New Coke and about Teddy Ruxpin. It was like truly Christmas for podcasters for us.
Was this more work than normal? I mean, you guys talked about in that process episode how much work goes into any week, but this one sounded like just a huge production.
I don't know, Brett. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it was a huge production. It didn't feel like more work than other ones because I think this is fair to say for both of us, where something becomes really difficult is where we can't find the story structure. You know, when we can't figure out how to arc it or how to do it quite. We know we have all the information, but we can't quite figure out how to go from point A to B to C to D. And even though it took us a while to kind of figure out the whole we found a VCR tape thing, I don't know. I think we figured this one out. And then once we did, it was a lot of work, but it was fun and we knew what we were doing. And I think things feel like more work for us when we're struggling to figure out what we're doing than when we're doing it.
Yeah, we got a little lucky there in the structure though, because we ended up landing on that Linus speech at the end.
Right.
So it ends up having this really nice macro. Like I remember when we decided that, we were like, oh yeah, this has to be here. And so there's a lot of that, like kind of waiting for the show to tell us like what do we need to do, which is gratifying.
It's funny because I'm looking through it, the various different topics that you guys have covered in so many episodes, and it's amazing to me probably how many of those were kind of intertwined into the production of that Christmas episode, you know, in terms of creativity and process and so on and so forth. And it's a wonderful example. You guys are in trouble next December. That's all I've got to say.
I've got ideas already.
Oh, yeah? Okay. Because I don't know if you're just going to pull out the WTS favorite next December or if you're going to try to come back with another part.
We got to do it again.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome. I'm looking forward to it. Folks, you should subscribe just for that, honestly. And who cares? We're a couple of weeks past the holiday. Go back and listen to that episode, and you'll know why we're all kind of gushing over that.
Should do a Christmas in July episode. That's
there
what
you go. I loved it. A couple other things I wanted to cover with you guys. The clips, which is one of the things I've alluded to a couple different times about its uniqueness. How do you guys go about finding these? What's the thought process on what movie, TV show, stand-up comedy special, music, whatever? How do you guys go about finding these things to interject with sort of what you guys are presenting as sort of the lesson of the episode?
Well, it's a little bit of a secret sauce. If I was to give the secret sauce in one word, I might say Google.
It is.
Sure.
I mean, it has become more interesting because I think what happened, right, was that when we started, certainly for me, I feel like I had a file cabinet in my brain of all these clips. Oh, we're going to use that one and that one and that. But like, you know, we use those up, or a lot of them, right? And I've created a process. I mean, I don't think it would be worth kind of going through it all but I've just created a process that definitely involves Google of, you know, there's different sites that have movie clips on them and movie quotes on them. There's different ways that I search for stuff that helps me to find stuff that's buried on page 15 and 16 in Google instead of page 1 or 2. So now what'll happen is more so than before. I think before, like the first, I don't know what, 10, 12, 15 episodes, I feel like almost every quote came out of my brain and then I found it on Google. Now I'll have more situations where I'll go, okay, I need a quote here about willpower being hard. And then I'll just start looking at things and I'll find like this week on willpower, we used a quote from Easy Money, Rodney Dangerfield. It wasn't like that popped out of my brain. It was that I went and looked for, you know, a pop culture movie clip about willpower and I found that. So there's a lot of time, like for me, a lot of time that goes into finding those clips. And then, you know, that's definitely, I don't know, 80, 85% me. But then Nick will do one of two things. Either I'm stuck and I'll just be like, Nick, what do we use here? Or, which is my favorite part, where Nick will send me the edit of the show. The show's done, and he's just put stuff in without telling me that he was like, "Oh, this should go here and this should go here." So then I get kind of like the experience our listeners get, where I get to hear, "Oh, that was cool. I wouldn't have known that." So yeah, so it's just this. But it's, I think we both kind of hear stuff in our head, like, "Oh, there should be a clip here, and it should maybe be about this." Like Nick will often put notes in the script where he'll say, "Let's put a clip here about this," or something that's talking about, and then we just go out and find them.
I mean, they serve as really great. I mean, they're just these shortcuts. Again, I cannot stress that enough. That they become like an authority somehow. Like the clip exists, and you can find the right one. They serve as a way for the listener to go like, "Oh, these guys aren't crazy. Like, here's this thing. We've talked about this before." So it's really nice, and that's not even including the clips that are actually like TED Talks or lectures, which are actually related specifically.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. We're tending to talk about the pop culture clips that we put in as accents, but we also, bring in TED Talk clips, interviews from radio, like different things where, so the clips we have of experts in our show are not just people that we interview, but there's also public domain stuff that we use.
And Nick, what does all this do to the editing process? As a very basic skill editor myself, this sounds like, well, a monster to put together as an edit. I mean, practical question first, because somebody's going to ask me, what do you use to edit in?
Well, yeah, I use Audition. But here's the thing. When I made those first shows that Brett heard for that other client and that sort of got us connected, and then the first episode that we made, which one was it, Brett?
On Time Is Late.
Yeah, that show was actually done in Audacity, which is a beast to do. It takes forever. And before I went, like the week before I went to San Francisco, I was actually on vacation with friends. I was going to be gone for 4 or 5 months. And I actually spent that week just like really trying to get into the workflow of Audition just so I could produce this show, like really.
And have you got it down to sort of a science now? Because it just sounds like an editing monstrosity to most people.
I will say that there are some things about Audition for those. I know that's right. I'm talking to podcasters. I will say this. There are some things about Audition that are great for public radio, like segments, like if we're doing the news. Radiolab, they use Pro Tools. And so there's things I've started poking around in Logic Pro, and I'm thinking about Pro Tools just to be able to have more fluidity in production of music, particularly, and in some sound shaping that I have to kind of do outside of the program, then bring in, and then I'm having to time it out specific. It becomes a beast that way. I bet you if I edited in Pro Tools, I would write more music on the show just because it would be easier.
When you talk about Where There's Smoke being a potential business card, in terms of audio production skill set, I don't think there's a better business card you could put forth terms of the values, because not only that, it sounds great. All of this, folks, ties together so well, and it's clear even from just a standard listener. I mean, there's a lot of listeners as well, passionate podcast listeners that are listening right now. And folks, you have heard badly produced podcasts, and
I have made badly produced.
There you go. What Brett and Nick are putting out here, it is clear that they have put the time and the effort into producing something that will definitely sound great. I mean, you don't see crazy volumes changing when the clips come in, or you don't hear crazy cuts or anything like that. It's very smooth and done so well. So definitely my compliments to both of you on the production part for sure.
Well, I will say though that I think one of the other big things that separates the show is that the edit will happen. Usually, it happens in like a day and a half, right? That's the edit window that we kind of cram through. But it's the 4 or 5 days before that where there's scripting happen. Like that's where the general shape of the show happens. And most podcasts, that's just time primitive. Like you don't have somebody named Brett who's slaving on a script over there so that there's something else to do, and then we get to check in. So we get to sort of mutually check in. I think Brett knows general rules of edits for me now, like kind of what I'm going to do. And so we get to kind of play with each other as we go and try to shape the show throughout the week and then pop it out at the last minute.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not digging into that right now, folks, only because I really want to point you back to that January 5th episode on Process. It was a replay from May 26th of 15. And you will hear the edit is just a portion, but like Nick just pointed out, all the real work is much earlier in the week.
And having said that, that show particularly was maybe the hardest show to edit. So there it is, a meta circle right there.
There you go. I want to talk about just one other quick kind of fun topic because I'm curious sort of where it came from. The artwork, it stands out, which is, I say this on a lot of my previous episodes. Folks, if you are a podcaster out there, do not underestimate the value of your artwork. I swear, I'm always looking at the Pocket Cast recommended homepage, if you will, whenever I go to hit the plus sign and look in Pocket Cast. I think that's where I originally found you guys. And your artwork fits right in with so many of those top tier podcasts out there. Is there a story behind how this got made?
There is a little bit of a story. I also think that Nick and I both from day one felt like it was really important.
Yeah.
Like really important. And actually, I ended up getting a pretty good deal on it. And I think I paid £300, which is probably like $400 or $500. And I remember at the time being like, oh, but in retrospect, I probably would have paid $2,000 for it. Like it is the thing people see. And to your point, because we are talking to a lot of podcasters, I'm in various podcast forums and various podcast groups, and I often see people thinking about cover art, and like people will respond and be like, oh, just go get something done on Fiverr, don't worry about it. And I'm always like, no, it is literally like, if you never get a second chance to make a first impression, it is the only first impression you have, right? So I think it's really important.
I tell clients when, like, oh, they're really excited about podcasting, and they'll want to do like, oh, I saw this package, I can get this mic and do these things. I will always recommend the simplest package, but pay for that artwork. Like I really, because you can do, you can be smart with cheaper equipment, but you can never replace what your show looks like.
So I do like, just a quick story is basically I was trying to get it created. I was doing it on 99 Design. I paid kind of the upper echelon of 99 Design. For those people who know, it's kind of a, an I don't know if auctions, it's like a crowdsourcing, right? People bid stuff and then you get to give them feedback like, no, more this, more that. So I was on 99 Design, and the thing about 99 Design, you don't have to pay for it unless you find something you like. And I was just so frustrated because nobody was understanding what I wanted, and everything looked like everything else. And it was so like, everything was a cover version of a cover version of a cover version of a cover version, to use a music reference. And I had put out feelers to friends, and finally my buddy in the UK said, oh, you've got to check out my buddy Sam Goff. And so I reached out to Sam, and he was like, well, yeah, send me an email, tell me what you want. So I sent him an email basically saying, this is my thought, and this is kind of what the show's about, and I kind of wanted to reflect this. And I literally got that logo back in 25 minutes. Oh, and it was crazy because I was like, oh my God, this guy just nailed what I'm looking for. Someone, that's the thing about design. If you're not a designer, right? Somebody else shows you what you wanted because you didn't know what it was, right? And I remember I joked with Sam later. I said, look, I'm so appreciative and I understand that I'm paying you for your skill, not for your time. But in retrospect, I would have waited a couple hours to send it to me just to make me feel like it took you longer to create. Because he literally just turned it around in 20 minutes. It was crazy. And that was it. It was,
It's a logo that, and I've said this all the time, that I didn't fully understand until we were well into the show. Like until at least a few weeks where I was, Sam did a really good job of capturing this little bit of like, a nuanced sort of meta take on the logo itself. Like I had not put all of the iconography together properly. So all the people who just glance at the logo should go check out like what's really happening there.
Do we want to explain what's happening or just let people interpret it?
Well, they can figure it out. Well, it's not hard. I just looked at it. I was like, oh, hey.
I mean, the big thing is that the O and where there's smoke is a map pin, right? Like you would see on Google Maps.
It wasn't. Then there was the fire though that it was specifically finishing the phrase, right?
Yes. The fire in the pin
in the O. Yep.
And again, it's that idea, like I explained earlier, right? That we're going to start in one place, but we're going to take you to a very specific place. And so that was one of the things I expressed to him. It's like because I had this idea of something like "You Are Here" on the logo, like there's all this distraction, but but I didn't really know how to do it. And he was the one who created this map pin with the fire, and yeah, it's brilliant. It's great.
Yeah, and it does. If anybody, I can't imagine how many people. I bet it's a lot more than any of us really know. Scrolling through the podcast app in iTunes or through Pocket Casts or Overcast or whatever your app of choice is, and when you have the visual layout of all the shows out there recommended or categories or charts or whatever, if you can pop off that list for whatever reason, catching somebody's eye with that that iconography, you're already ahead of the game, and that I think is definitely the job that the album artwork is doing for you guys. I love it.
He actually sent it to us, if I remember correctly, in like a mocked up iTunes cover. Correct?
Oh yeah, he did. Yeah.
So if you opened up iTunes, this is what this would look like in a small format, and
Nice.
it was perfect.
Yeah, so you would think. I mean, I've never used this app because I've been married since it came out. But think about Tinder, right? It's like yes, no, yes, no. I mean, that's people are visual people.
Yes.
They're looking at something. They're going, does that attract me or does that not attract me? And do you want people to swipe left or swipe right on your podcast logo?
I think
Do you know which is which, Brett?
Yes, swipe right is approve.
There you go. But you know what? You're dead right. You're dead right, Brett. Because I really believe. I know for a fact there are great shows out there that I've never listened to, I've never given a chance to, I've never given a second thought of. It's just because their album artwork sucks. It's crazy colors and it's the picture of the host standing in the corner with their arms crossed or something like that, and it's
Or
like,
Nick, it's a dog driving a train.
was that the first draft? Dog driving a train away from a fire?
No, that's fine.
It's another story. It's actually a really awesome podcast art in the fact that it's I don't even know what the definition for it is. I actually love it. I think I love it for all the reasons why probably some people might not.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to harken back all the way to the start of our conversation, gentlemen. You had talked about how sort of there was this could be a potential stigma attached to a self-help podcast. And I'll admit, that was sort of me at first, right? It was the album artwork that attracted me. What I typically do is I see the album artwork, then I oftentimes check out their Twitter account because I live on Twitter, and then I sort of scroll through previous posts and I say, oh, okay, this is kind of interesting to see what they're talking about, topics. Then I go and look in the catalog, look through back episodes, and I remember, and I don't remember the first episode I heard. It was probably 2.5, 3 months ago. And then I heard hearing self-help, and I was like, But then as it got into it, I saw the production values. I saw sort of the, kind of the comedy and the clips, and then the value that came from, then I started giving a sort of a second look to the catalog in the different topics. And I started picking and choosing different topics I wanted to hear more about, and quickly realized that this is something that is at the top of my must listen list. And folks, I think you will find the same thing as well. So my compliments to both of you gentlemen. Anything that we should cover before we wrap this up? Anything you haven't told folks you'd like to share?
Brett. That's how I did that.
You know what? Here's what I'll say. This was my pitch, for the first 8 months of our show. And I haven't been doing it much lately because, but it still should be, which was, I would always say to people, look, just listen to 10 minutes of our show. Just
choose a topic.
Yeah, just choose a topic, maybe something that resonates with you, and just listen to 10 minutes. And at those end of those 10 minutes, you'll either be like, not for me, or you'll be like, whoa. But again, that's one of the things I'm proud of about our show. There's a lot of podcasts out there that are just interview, Mark Maron. I mean, I love Mark Maron, but I could listen to 50 different episodes of Mark Maron and listen to the first 10 minutes and be like, And then I could listen to 20 other ones and listen to the first 10 minutes and love it. It's going to be hit or miss probably based on who the guest is, but I really feel like our show, like any show, we treat every show as if it's the only show. And, listen to 10 minutes. And if it's for you, cool. And if it's not, cool. But, we put our heart and soul into this show. And, we are proud of it. We are proud of how much we care for the show, which is really about how much we care for our listeners.
Well, I definitely want you guys to tell the listeners where they can find the show, all the social media links where they can check out what you guys are doing. And also, if you would, please tell folks about the Patreon.
Well, the website is wherethere'ssmoke.co. And our Twitter handle, after much debate and discussion, is @ExploreWTS. WTS stands for Where There's Smoke. And we've got a Patreon campaign going on. We're just trying to find a way to get some support and production of the show. It's obviously, as we've talked about, very time consuming. You can hear it in our process episode. And that is at supportwts.com. That's right, Brett? Yeah.
Yeah, supportwts.com. Yeah, and many people listening here probably haven't heard our show yet. So, for us, it's really about, people, once you hear the show, if it brings you value and you feel you want to support it, great. I mean, Nick and I both support other podcasts. We both have supported many Kickstarter campaigns. We support art that we believe in. And our goal, and we said this when we launched the campaign with the Patreon campaign, neither one of us is getting rich off this thing. We're just looking to have the freedom to say no to other things. Because if we can make enough money off the show that Nick can say no to one more client, then we can have more time to produce it. I can say no to one speaking gig. I can have another day to research. So we're trying to create some freedom so that we can continue to produce this at a quality level and, keep the show where we want it to be. And we could get ads. We're not exactly, we're not getting 1 million downloads a month, but we're getting enough downloads that we could get ads. But we don't want to do that. We just feel like if our audience is willing to support our show for the same amount of money we get from ads, then we get to keep creating something that's ours, our communities. And we just don't want to do that yet if we don't have to.
Yeah. Can you imagine, instead of going out of the Christmas special where we, let's do a Christmas special, but before the opening credits, you heard an ad for mattresses. It just seems like we really want to avoid that and keep the integrity of the show and keep in touch with our listeners. That's what we're trying to do.
Well, if for some reason you guys do end up with, ad sponsorships or anything like that, then at least just keep them off the holiday specials, please.
And I want to state right here, because I don't want this to come back and bite.
Yeah.
We're not opposed to ads. I'm not saying that in the future we won't have ads,
right.
But it's just got to be a cost-benefit ratio. And we don't think it's worth it right now for where we are in the show and what we're creating with people. And again, because we're supporters of art, we believe that there's enough of our audience that would give us, $5, $10, $20 a month so that we can keep this intimate thing we have. And so as long as we can keep that going, we're going to do our best to do it. But, it's we're all in this together, as we like to say on our show.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the link to that Patreon, as well as the links to the website, to the Twitter account, everything we've talked about here on this episode will be in the show notes, folks, as well as on the website. So make sure you check those out. And, folks, I tell you this every week. Take a chance on something I'm telling you about. There's a reason that I've reached out to these folks to tell you all about the behind-the-scenes story of these shows. It is because I firmly believe it's that great. And Where There's Smoke is definitely fits into that category. So, Brett and Nick, thank you guys both for taking your time to join me here.
Right on, Dan. I appreciate it, man. This is fun. Nick and I don't get to do this very often. It's only the second time we've ever done an interview like this together. So thanks for the invitation. It's great.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks, Dan.
Absolutely. And folks, that'll do it for this week, episode 74 of the Podcast Digest. Until next week, my name's Dan Lizette. I'll talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.